It is just before dawn on the 25th of April, 1974, and a song is playing on the radio in Lisbon. It is a slow song, a sad one, about a town in the south where the people hold the greatest power. Most of the city is asleep. But in barracks and radio stations and quiet street corners, a few hundred young army officers are listening for exactly this. The song is the signal. Within hours, columns of soldiers are moving toward the center of the capital. They are not there to defend the government. They are there to end it. By mid-morning, a young captain named Fernando Salgueiro Maia has led his men into the heart of the city and halted his armored column in a square called the Largo do Carmo. Inside a nearby barracks, the head of the government, Marcelo Caetano, is hiding. Above the streets, the people of Lisbon are beginning to understand what is happening, and they come out of their homes. A woman named Celeste Caeiro, a worker at a restaurant that will not open that day, is carrying an armful of red carnations. On an impulse, she gives them to the soldiers. The soldiers, having nowhere else to put them, slide the flowers into the barrels of their rifles. That image will name the whole revolution. By the end of that single spring day, a dictatorship that had ruled Portugal for more than 40 years is finished. Almost no shots are fired. Fewer than 5 people die in a nation of 9 million. A country that had been sealed shut for 2 generations is suddenly, dizzyingly open. But nobody in that square could have told you what would come next, because on that morning, Portugal was not the country you might picture today. It was one of the poorest, least educated, most isolated nations in all of Western Europe. It was fighting 3 losing wars on another continent, and its long, strange story was about to begin again, from almost nothing. This is Portugal. A country smaller than the American state of Indiana, pressed against the far western edge of Europe, where the land runs out and the Atlantic begins. For most of the modern era, it has been the continent's quiet corner, a place travelers pass through on the way to somewhere else. A country the rest of Europe rarely thought about at all. And that inattention hides something remarkable. "50 years ago, Portugal was a fascist dictatorship. Its people could not vote, its newspapers were censored. Its secret police, a force known as the PIDE, kept files on ordinary citizens and disappeared those who spoke too loudly. Roughly a quarter of the population could not read. In the villages of the interior, families lived much as their great-grandparents had, on bread, olives, and whatever the land would give. And the state was pouring nearly half of everything it had into a war it could not win. In Angola, in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, tens of thousands of young Portuguese conscripts were fighting to hold on to an empire that no longer wanted to be held. The regime called it a civilizing mission. In truth, it was the last, exhausted grip of a colonial project that had begun 5 centuries earlier, and it was bleeding the country dry. Today, Portugal is something almost no one predicted: a stable democracy, a member of the European Union. In the year 2025, one of the most respected voices in economics named it the best-performing economy in the developed world. Its capital is one of the most visited cities on the continent. Its people are among the longest lived on Earth. How a country travels from that April morning to this one, in a single human lifetime, is the story we are going to follow. It is a story of a place reinventing itself so completely that its own grandparents would barely recognize it. But it is not only a story of triumph, because the same forces that lifted Portugal up are now raising a harder question. A country can be reborn. The harder thing to answer is who the reborn country is for. To understand any of it, you have to start with the land itself, because Portugal was shaped, long before any revolution, by the simple fact of being poor in soil and rich in one thing only: the sea. Look at Portugal on a map, and you notice something immediately. It is almost all coastline, nearly 1,000 kilometers of Atlantic edge, and behind it, a narrow country that never rises far from the water. To the east, the whole length of the border is shared with a single, much larger neighbor, Spain. For most of history, that has left Portugal with only two directions to look: inward, toward a hard and mountainous interior, or outward, toward the ocean. The interior, for centuries, gave very little. Much of it is thin, stony ground, baked hard in summer and battered by Atlantic weather in winter. So the Portuguese did what people do when the land will not feed them. They turned to the water. And in doing so, a small kingdom on the edge of the world became, for one astonishing century, the center of it. But we will come to the ships. First the land, because the land still holds the older Portugal, the one the revolution and the tourism boom have not reached. In the far northeast, along the border with Spain, a river cuts down through terraced hillsides in a series of enormous ancient steps. This is the Douro, the longest river to run entirely through Portugal, and its valley is one of the oldest wine regions on the planet. For more than 2,000 years, people have carved these slopes by hand into narrow shelves of stone and soil, each one just wide enough to hold a row of vines. The reason is the schist, the layered rock that makes up these hills. It splits into flat plates that trap the day's heat and release it slowly through the night, and it forces the vine's roots down through the cracks in search of water. The result is a grape of extraordinary concentration. And out of that grape came the wine that made this valley famous and that tied Portugal for 300 years to a country far to the north. Because port wine, the sweet fortified wine that takes its name from the city of Porto at the river's mouth, was largely an English invention of taste. In the early 1700s, at war with France and cut off from French wine, English merchants came looking for a substitute, and they found it here. They fortified the Douro's wine with brandy so it would survive the sea voyage home, and they built their trading houses along the river in Porto. The wine went out, the money came back, and for a long time, that was the shape of the northern economy. A landscape of astonishing beauty, worked by some of the poorest people in Europe, producing a luxury for someone else's table. The families who tended these terraces did not grow rich. They grew just enough to stay, and when even that failed, they did the other thing the North has always done. They left. This is the part of the Portuguese story that rarely appears on a postcard. For more than a century, the story of the North was a story of departure. From these villages, generation after generation packed what they could carry and went. To Brazil in the 1800s, to France and Germany and Luxembourg in the 1960s, fleeing the poverty and the dictatorship's wars, to the United States and Canada. By some counts, more people of Portuguese descent now live outside the country than the population that ever stayed. Walk through the interior villages today, and you can read that history in the silence. Houses with the shutters closed for good, schools with no children, whole hamlets where the youngest resident is 70. The land did not fail these people, the economy did. And when a place cannot hold its own young, it begins, slowly, to empty. Remember these empty villages? We will come back to them, because half a century after the revolution, the question of who fills them again has become one of the most charged questions in the country. Rise up out of the Douro and go higher into the mountains of the north, and you reach the wildest ground Portugal has. The Serra da Estrela, the Mountains of the Star, whose highest point stands at nearly 2,000 meters, the roof of mainland Portugal. And to the northwest, the country's only national park, the Peneda Gerês, a landscape of granite domes, oak forest, and rivers cold enough to take your breath. Here, in these hills, live animals that the modern country has all but forgotten it still shares its ground with. And among them is one of the oldest inhabitants of all. The Guarano is a small, dark, sturdy pony, and it has been in these mountains for a very long time. Look at the rock carvings in the nearby Coa Valley, images scratched into stone by people at the end of the last ice age, and you find horses that look startlingly like the Guarano still standing in the hills today. For something close to 20,000 years, this animal has grazed these slopes. It survived the Ice Age. It survived the Romans. It survived every empire and famine and war that passed over this ground. And now it faces the quietest threat of all. Not a predator, not a hunter, but abandonment. As the shepherds leave the mountains for the cities, the open pastures the Guarano depends on close over with scrub, and the ancient herds thin. An animal that outlasted 20,000 years of history may not outlast a single generation of people walking away. It endures, for now, in the gap between the Portugal that is leaving and the Portugal that has not yet decided what these mountains are for. Those mountains hold another survivor, one we will meet again before this journey ends. For now, know only that somewhere in the emptying north, on ground with fewer and fewer people, a wild thing is still holding on. But turn south, and the country changes entirely. The mountains flatten, the green gives way to gold, and you enter the vast, slow, sun-struck heart of Portugal, the Alentejo. The Alentejo is the largest region in the country and the emptiest. It is a rolling plain of wheat and cork, oak and olive, of whitewashed villages baking under an enormous sky, where the summer heat can climb past 40 degrees and the horizon runs uninterrupted for miles. And it holds one of the strangest contradictions in Portugal. This is the richest agricultural land the country has, and it has long been home to some of its poorest people. For centuries, most of the Alentejo was owned by a tiny number of families in enormous estates, some of them the size of small towns. The land was worked by laborers who owned nothing, who were hired by the day, and who went hungry when the day's work ran out. And so, when the revolution came in 1974, it was here, on these plains, that it went furthest. In the months after the dictatorship fell, landless workers across the Alentejo did something extraordinary and, to the old order, terrifying. They walked onto the great estates, and they took them. Within a year, more than a fifth of Portugal's farmland had been seized and turned into hundreds of collective farms, run by the very people who had worked it. Their slogan was simple and ancient. The land, they said, belongs to those who work it. It did not last. In the years that followed, as the revolution's fever cooled and the country steadied into a more conventional democracy, much of the seized land was handed back. The great cooperatives faded. But something of that moment remains in the Alentejo still, in its politics, in its memory, in the deep red thread that runs through its towns. It was, for a brief window, one of the most radical experiments in Europe. And then the window closed. Above all this, largely indifferent to who owns the ground beneath it, stands the tree that has defined this landscape for 1,000 years, the cork oak. The cork oak is one of the most remarkable trees on Earth, and Portugal is its capital. This single country produces roughly half of all the cork in the world. Drive through the Alentejo and you see them everywhere, spaced wide across the golden fields in an open woodland the Portuguese call the montado. Their lower trunks stripped bare and stained a deep rust orange. That stripping is the miracle of the tree. Every 9 years or so, skilled workers move through the montado with axes and with astonishing care peel the thick outer bark clean away from the living trunk without harming the tree beneath. The cork oak simply grows it back. It is one of the only trees in the world that can be harvested again and again across a lifespan of 2 centuries without ever being cut down. In fact, in Portugal, cutting one down without permission has been forbidden by law for hundreds of years. Think about what that tree is. A living thing whose entire strategy for survival is to give up its outer skin over and over and grow a new one and keep standing. Hold on to that image, because by the end of this story, it may be the truest picture we have of the country itself. The montado is not only cork, it is one of the richest ecosystems in Europe, an entire world woven around these scattered oaks. Wild boar move through the shade, rare eagles nest in the high branches, and on a still summer afternoon, when the heat presses down and everything human has gone indoors, the whole landscape fills with a single, pulsing, electric sound. That sound is the cicada. For most of its life, a cicada is invisible, a pale nymph living underground, sometimes for years, feeding in darkness on the sap of tree roots. Then, in one summer, it climbs into the light, splits its old skin, and emerges with wings. And for a few brief weeks, the males do nothing but sing, vibrating a pair of membranes on their bodies thousands of times a second to produce that shimmering wall of sound. It is the voice of the Portuguese South, a creature that waits underground in silence for years, for the single season it will spend in the sun. There is something in that patience, that long, dark wait for a short, bright reward, that anyone who lived through the poverty of old Portugal would understand completely. And there is one creature here that has made its peace with people more completely than any other. Above the villages of the Alentejo, on the tops of church towers and chimneys and electricity pylons, sit the great, untidy nests of the white stork. For generations, these tall white birds crossed the whole of Africa each winter and returned each spring, and their arrival was the signal that the warm months had come. But in recent decades, many of them have simply stopped leaving. They have found that the land now feeds them the whole year round, and so they stay, raising their young on the same rooftops their ancestors used, clattering their long red bills over towns that have otherwise grown quiet. In a country that spent a century watching its own people fly away and not come back, there is something quietly moving about a bird that decided at last to stay. From the plains of the Alentejo, follow the lands south and west until it can go no further, and you reach the Algarve, the tourist Portugal, the Portugal of golden cliffs and turquoise coves, of holiday apartments and English breakfasts, the coast that half of Northern Europe seems to visit at least once. And it is beautiful, but it is not, historically, why this coast matters. Because at the very southwestern tip of the Algarve, where the land ends in a wall of cliffs above a cold and endless ocean, something began that changed the entire world. The year is 1415. Portugal is a small, young kingdom, barely 3 centuries old, hemmed in by Spain and facing nothing but water. And a prince, remembered by history as Henry the Navigator, gathers around this windswept headland the sailors, map-makers, and shipbuilders of his age. He is not looking for a holiday coast, he is looking for a way out, a way past the edge of the known world. What follows is one of the most consequential bursts of exploration in human history. Portuguese caravels, small and fast and built for the open Atlantic, push further and further down the coast of Africa, into waters European sailors had always believed no ship could return from. They round the southern tip of Africa, they cross to India, they reach Brazil and Japan and China. For a brief, brilliant century, this tiny country on the edge of Europe controlled a trading empire that spanned the globe, and the wealth of the world poured back through the mouth of the Tagus into Lisbon. And here, the story turns dark, and it must be told plainly. Because that same fleet, that same genius for the sea, also opened one of the cruelest chapters in human history. It was Portuguese ships in the 1440s that first carried enslaved Africans back to Europe in significant numbers. Portugal did not merely take part in the transatlantic slave trade, it began it, and over the centuries that followed, it trafficked more human beings across the ocean than any other nation on Earth. The caravels that carried the maps and the spices carried this too. The wealth that built the monasteries of Lisbon was, in part, wealth wrung from stolen lives. Both things are true, and the country is still, slowly, learning to hold them together. The great age of the discoveries did not last. Other, larger powers, the Dutch, the English, the Spanish, rose to challenge Portugal and then to eclipse it. The empire shrank, the wealth thinned, and by the time the modern era arrived, the country that had once mapped the oceans had become a quiet backwater, living on the memory of a glory 500 years gone. You can feel that memory everywhere in Portugal. It has a name, a word the language holds that no other language quite translates. Saudade, a deep, aching longing for something lost, or someone gone, or a time that will not return. It is the emotion at the center of Portuguese identity, and you hear it most clearly in the country's music. But we will come to the music in the city where it lives. First, climb into the hills just west of the capital, where the Atlantic mist gathers in the trees, and you find a landscape that seems to belong to a fairy tale. This is Sintra, a cool, green, wooded ridge where for centuries the kings and nobles of Portugal built their summer palaces to escape the heat of Lisbon. The most famous of them, the Pina Palace, sits on the highest crag like something dreamed rather than designed, a riot of red and yellow towers, tiled domes, and stone carvings, blending every style the 19th century could imagine. Below it, Sunken gardens hold spiraling wells that descend deep into the earth, and grottos and paths that lead nowhere in particular. But it is worth pausing on what Sintra actually is. These palaces are exquisite. They are also monuments to a profound imbalance. They were built by a ruling class of extraordinary wealth in a country where the vast majority lived in poverty most of that class never had to see. The romance of Sintra is real. So is the fact that it was paid for by a society that gave almost nothing to the people at its base. The fairy tale and the injustice occupied the same hillside. In Portugal, they very often did. Come down from the hills and turn north, and you reach a city that holds the country's mind: Coimbra. Home to one of the oldest universities in the world, founded more than 7 centuries ago in the year 1290. Walk into its oldest library, the Joanina, and you enter a room built like a cathedral to knowledge, its walls lined floor to ceiling with gilded wood and tens of thousands of ancient books. To protect those books from insects, the library keeps a small colony of bats, which emerge at night to hunt among the shelves as they have for centuries. It is a place that takes the long memory of learning seriously. And that matters, because for much of the 20th century, Portugal's greatest wound was not a lack of beauty or history. It was a lack of schooling. The dictatorship did not want a highly educated population. An educated people asks questions. So generation after generation left school early, if they went at all, and the country fell further and further behind its neighbors in the one resource that turned out to matter most in the modern world: what its people knew. Closing that gap would become one of the great projects of the Reborn Portugal. It is not closed yet. And some memories in Portugal survived by hiding. In the high, cold country near the Spanish border sits a small town called Belmonte, and it holds one of the most extraordinary stories of endurance in Europe. When the Inquisition came to Portugal at the end of the 1400s, the country's Jews were given an impossible choice: convert, flee, or die. Many converted in public and were watched ever after for any sign that they had not truly changed. But in Belmonte, a community of them did something almost unimaginable. They went on being Jewish in complete secret, passing their prayers and their rituals down in whispers from mother to daughter for nearly 500 years, while showing a Catholic face to the world. They were only rediscovered by the wider Jewish world in the 20th century. 5 centuries of faith kept alive in the dark in a single mountain town by people who never once believed they were the last. If Belmonte kept its faith in secret, one town in the center of the country turned faith into something the whole world could see. It is called Fatima. In the year 1917, 3 young shepherd children claimed that a woman of light appeared to them in a field, month after month, and spoke to them. Word spread, crowds gathered, and on one October day, tens of thousands of people assembled in the rain and later swore they had seen the sun itself dance in the sky. The Catholic Church eventually recognized the events, and Fatima became one of the great pilgrimage sites of the world, drawing millions of the faithful each year, some of whom crossed the final stretch to the shrine on their knees. The dictatorship understood the power of that faith, and it used it. The regime built its whole idea of Portugal on 3 words: God, homeland, and family. It offered its people a bargain, and it was a bargain built on poverty. Be humble, it said, be devout, be poor, and content in your poverty, and the nation will be pure. For decades, faith and hardship were bound together and sold as a single virtue. It is worth naming that bargain clearly, because the revolution of 1974 was, among many other things, a rejection of it. A refusal to be told any longer that poverty was a form of grace. When those soldiers put carnations in their rifles, they were not only ending a government, they were ending an idea. The idea that a country and its people were meant to stay small. And here we should step back and say something the wider world tends to forget about who the Portuguese actually are. Because the story is not only European. Far out in the Atlantic, hundreds of kilometers from the mainland, lie two clusters of islands that are as fully Portuguese as Lisbon itself: the Azores and Madeira. The Azores are 9 green volcanic islands rising straight out of the deep ocean, a landscape of crater lakes, hot springs, and pastures impossibly green from the constant Atlantic rain. For centuries, their economy was tied to the sea in the most direct way imaginable: whaling. Men from these islands rowed out in open boats to hunt sperm whales with hand-thrown harpoons, one of the most dangerous jobs on Earth. When the whaling ended in the 1980s, the islanders turned the very same waters into one of the finest places in the world to watch whales alive. The boats still go out. The harpoons are now cameras. And from these islands too, people left. The Azores sent waves of emigrants to New England and to California, to the point where whole American towns fill each summer with Azorean festivals, and where the Portuguese, spoken in parts of Massachusetts, still carries the accent of islands 3,000 miles away. This is the thing the world forgets. To be Portuguese has never simply meant to live in Portugal. It has meant, as often as not, to be somewhere else and to carry the country with you. A nation defined not by its borders, but by its leaving and its longing to return. Madeira, further south, tells a gentler version of the same tale. A single dramatic island of terraced hillsides and laurel forest, so ancient and rare, it is protected as a treasure of the whole planet. It gave the world a famous fortified wine, and it gave the world more recently a footballer whose name is known in every country the old caravels ever reached. Even now, the island's greatest export is often its people, and its deepest tie to the mainland is the memory carried by everyone who left. And the ocean that carried all those people away has never once grown tame. On the central coast, at a fishing town called Nazaré, the seabed does something found almost nowhere else on Earth. A colossal underwater canyon, deeper than the Grand Canyon, runs straight in toward the shore, and it funnels the raw power of Atlantic storms into a single point, until the water rears up into the largest waves ever surfed, moving walls of ocean as tall as a 10-story building. The same sea that made Portugal rich and then poor and always restless still breaks against it with a force that draws the bravest surfers alive. Portugal has never once been able to look away from the water. It never will. Which brings us at last back to where the revolution began, to the city that holds all of these threads at once: Lisbon. Lisbon is one of the oldest cities in Western Europe, older than Rome, built across a series of steep hills above the wide mouth of the Tagus, where the river finally meets the ocean. Its light is famous, a soft, silver, sea-washed light that has drawn painters and poets for centuries. Its oldest quarter, the Alfama, is a tangle of streets so narrow and so steep that in places the city runs its trams up them at angles that seem to defy gravity, past walls covered in painted ceramic tiles. Those tiles are worth understanding because they are one of the deepest expressions of the Portuguese soul. They are called azulejos, glazed tiles in blue and white and gold, and they cover everything here: churches, palaces, ordinary houses, entire railway stations. One station in Porto is lined with more than 20,000 of them, telling the history of the nation in painted scenes across its walls. In a country that never developed a great tradition of painting on canvas, the Portuguese instead painted their history onto the surfaces of the buildings they lived in. A whole people's memory, glazed and fired and fixed to the walls of daily life. And Lisbon's walls have needed rebuilding before. On the morning of the 1st of November, 1755, on All Saints' Day, with the churches full, an enormous earthquake struck beneath the sea just off the coast. In minutes, much of the city collapsed. Then the sea drew back and returned as a wall of water that swept up the Tagus. Then fire, from the thousands of candles lit for the holy day, took what the water had missed. Tens of thousands died in a single morning. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in European history, and it shook not only the city, but the confidence of an entire age, forcing the thinkers of Europe to ask how such suffering could exist in a world they believed was watched over.
What rose from that ruin
Tells you something about the Portuguese character. The king's chief minister, a hard and brilliant man remembered simply as the Marquis of Pombal, is said to have responded to the catastrophe with a single instruction: bury the dead and feed the living. And then he rebuilt the center of Lisbon from nothing, on a strict grid of wide, elegant streets, using some of the first earthquake-resistant buildings ever designed, timber frames engineered to sway and hold when the ground moves again. That downtown, calm and rational and rebuilt on the ashes of disaster, is still the heart of the city today. Portugal has a long habit of rebuilding itself. The revolution was not the first time, it was only the largest. And it is in Lisbon, in the small, dark taverns of the Alfama, that you hear the sound of everything this country has felt. Fado, the music of saudade. Fado is not happy music, and it is not meant to be. A single singer, accompanied by the round, weeping notes of the Portuguese guitar, gives voice to longing itself, to the sailor who did not come home, to the love that ended, to the country left behind. It was born in the poorest streets of Lisbon, among dock workers and the wives of men lost at sea, and for a long time, the respectable world looked down on it. Then, a woman named Amalia Rodriguez, with one of the great voices of the 20th century, carried fado out of those taverns and onto the stages of the world, and made the private ache of a poor country into an art the whole world could recognize. When she died in 1999, Portugal declared 3 days of national mourning. They understood that she had been singing them to themselves. So this is the country the revolution inherited: ancient, proud, beautiful, and poor, haunted by a glory 5 centuries gone, bound together by faith and music and the long ache of everyone who had left. The question, on that April morning in 1974, was what a people like that could build once they were finally free to build anything at all. The answer at first was chaos. The 2 years after the revolution were wild and uncertain, a whirl of provisional governments, of near civil war between left and right, of a country that had been silent for 40 years, suddenly arguing with itself about everything at once. And into that chaos came a shock the new Portugal had not planned for. As the empire ended and the African colonies became independent nations, the Portuguese who had lived there, some for generations, had to leave, and fast. In the space of barely a year, more than 500,000 people, by some counts closer to 1 million, poured back into the mainland with almost nothing. They were called the retornados, the returned. A small, poor country that could barely feed itself suddenly had to absorb a wave of refugees equal to 1/10 of its own population. It was a crisis that should have broken the fragile new democracy. Somehow, it did not. Because slowly, through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Portugal made a decision that would define everything that followed. Having spent 500 years looking outward across the ocean, it turned, for the first time, decisively toward Europe. It wanted in. On the first day of 1986, Portugal joined what would become the European Union. And for a poor country on the edge of the continent, the effect was transformative. Money began to flow in. Structural funds meant to help the poorest members catch up, and the Portuguese used it to build the country they had never been able to afford. New roads and motorways reached villages that had known only dirt tracks. Bridges crossed rivers that had divided the country for centuries. Sanitation, telephones, universities, hospitals. Living standards rose faster than they ever had. In 1985, the average Portuguese earned barely half of what the average European did. Within 15 years, that gap had closed to a degree the country's grandparents would have thought impossible. It was not a perfect miracle. Portugal built roads more easily than it built industries, and it remained, in truth, a poorer and less productive economy than the wealthy north of Europe. But the direction was unmistakable. For the first time in living memory, the country was not emptying out. It was filling up. And then it adopted the single currency of Europe, the euro, tying its fortunes fully to the continent. For a while, it felt like the story was simply, finally, going to be one of steady rise.
It was not.
When the great financial crisis swept the world in 2008, it found in Portugal a country that had grown, quietly, dangerously indebted. And within 3 years, the crisis had arrived in full. In 2011, unable to borrow, on the very edge of bankruptcy, Portugal had to be rescued. It accepted an emergency loan of 78 billion euros from Europe and the International Monetary Fund. And with the money came the conditions. The years that followed were brutal. To satisfy its creditors, the government cut wages and pensions, raised taxes, and slashed spending. The economy shrank. Unemployment climbed toward 1 in 5, and among the young, it was close to 1 in 2. And so the oldest reflex in Portuguese history returned. The young began, once again, to leave. Some 200,000 of the country's best educated people, the very generation the new universities had produced, packed up and went abroad in search of work. It seemed for a moment as though the whole story of rebirth had been an illusion, and Portugal was sliding back to what it had always been. The quiet, poor corner of Europe sending its children away. And this is the moment, around the year 2013, where almost no one would have bet on Portugal. This is the low point, which is exactly why what happened next is so hard to believe. Because Portugal came back. It exited its bailout in 2014, and then, year after year, it began to grow again. And this time, it did something the country had never quite managed before. It made the world want to come to it. Tourism, which had always been a piece of the economy, became an engine. Travelers who had spent decades flying over Portugal on their way to Spain or Italy, suddenly discovered what had been sitting there all along. The light of Lisbon, the beaches of the Algarve, the wine of the Douro, the safety of a country that remarkably had become one of the most peaceful on the entire planet. And they came in numbers no one had imagined. In the year 2025, this nation of roughly 10 million people welcomed more than 32 million visitors. New hotels, new restaurants, new life poured into cities that had been shabby and half-empty a decade before. The old dockyards became galleries. The crumbling townhouses of the Alfama became guest houses. Money flowed. Confidence returned. And in that same year, one of the most respected names in global economics looked across all the wealthy nations of the world and named Portugal the economy of the year, the best performing developed economy on Earth. Stop and hold the full distance of that journey for a moment. In a single lifetime, one person could have been born under a fascist dictatorship in a country of censorship and secret police and enforced poverty, watched soldiers put flowers in their rifles on a spring morning, seen the empire collapse and the refugees flood home, endured the bailout and the years of hunger, and then, as an old man or woman, watched their small, forgotten country be named the best-run economy in the developed world. That is not a slow evolution. That is a nation remaking itself from the ground up, inside the memory of the people still living in it. It is, by any measure, one of the great turnarounds of modern Europe. The poor cousin of the continent has become in many ways its envy. And yet, the very success that saved Portugal has begun to fracture it. Because when the world falls in love with a country, the world also starts to buy it. The same tourism that filled the cities filled them too, with visitors who never left. Wealthy foreigners, remote workers, retirees from richer nations, drawn by the sunshine, the safety, and the low cost of living, began to arrive and to stay. The government, hungry for investment after the crisis, welcomed them, offering residence in exchange for money and generous tax deals to those who came. And the cost of living stopped being low. In the space of a decade, house prices across Portugal roughly doubled. In Lisbon, rents climbed to levels that would strain a wealthy Northern European in a country where more than half of all workers still earn less than €1,000 a month, and the minimum wage sits far below that. A remote worker arriving on a foreign salary could comfortably outbid almost any local family for almost any apartment in the capital. And so, a cruel arithmetic took hold. The reborn city became a place its own people could no longer afford to live in. Walk through central Lisbon now, and you can see both Portugals at once. The gleaming, restored, prosperous city that the world came to admire. And, pushed further and further out toward the edges, the Portuguese who built it, who survived the dictatorship and the bailout, and who now find themselves priced out of the streets their families lived in for generations. Anti-tourism protests have appeared in a country that had never known them. A new hard-right political party, campaigning on anger and on immigration, rose from a single seat in parliament to become, within a few short years, the main voice of opposition. The rebirth is real. So is the resentment growing in its shadow. And here, at last, the loop closes. Because the empty villages of the north, the ones we stood in near the beginning of this journey, the ones with the closed shutters and the 70-year-old children, are being filled again. But not, mostly, by returning Portuguese. They are being filled by foreigners with the means to buy a quiet life in a beautiful country. The land is no longer emptying. it is being bought. And the question the revolution asked, the question those farmers shouted on the plains of the Alentejo, the land belongs to those who work it, has come back in a form no one expected. Who does a country belong to when the country becomes a product the whole world wants? That question does not have an answer yet. Portugal is still, right now, in the middle of asking it. It has ended its golden visas and moved to control its holiday rentals and tried to build the homes its people need. Whether it can stay both prosperous and its own, whether a reborn country can remain a home and not become only a destination, is the story of Portugal's next 30 years. And no one, honestly, knows how it ends. Which returns us, in the end, to the wild north, and to the survivor I promised we would meet again. Somewhere in the emptying hills south of the Douro, in the ground that people are leaving, moves the Iberian wolf. Fewer than a few hundred of them remain on the Portuguese side of the mountains, in fragments, cut off from one another, holding on in a landscape that has fewer human beings in it every year. At dusk, if you are very lucky and very still, you might hear one call across a valley where the villages have gone dark. There is a strange symmetry in that howl. As Portugal reinvents itself, as its cities fill with the wealth and the crowds of the whole world, its oldest wild inhabitant holds on in the silence the people left behind. The country and the wolf are living out opposite versions of the same century. One is being discovered by everyone. The other survives precisely because it has been forgotten. And this is where I want to leave you with one last image, because we met, near the beginning, another animal, one whose story runs the other way. The Iberian lynx, the most endangered cat on Earth, so close to vanishing that only a handful were left alive at the start of this century. And through a long, patient, deliberate effort to bring it back, breeding it, feeding it, releasing it into the cork oak country of the south, the lynx has returned. From near nothing, there are now thousands. It is one of the great comebacks in the history of conservation. A country brought back from poverty, a cat brought back from extinction, a wolf holding on in the emptied hills, a tree that survives by giving up its skin and growing it again, and an old woman with an armful of carnations, handing flowers to soldiers on a spring morning without any idea that she was naming a revolution. None of them knew in the dark how the story would turn out. The lynx did not know it would come back. The country did not know it would be reborn. And Portugal today does not know whether the rebirth will hold or who it will belong to when the dust settles. But that perhaps is the truest thing this country has to teach, that a place written off as finished, poor, forgotten, over, can wait a long time in the dark, like a cicada underground, and then climb into the light and astonish everyone. And that even then, even in the sun, the questions do not end. They only change. The soldiers put flowers in their rifles, and a dictatorship fell, and a poor country began, slowly, impossibly, to become something new. 50 years later, it is still becoming it. And what it becomes next is still entirely unwritten. This has been Portugal. Thank you for traveling it with us. If you would like to keep exploring the world's most surprising places, one story at a time, take a moment to subscribe and stay a while. Until the next journey.